Content warning, discussions of death that some listeners might find upsetting. Welcome to the Newcastle Witches Podcast. Thank you for listening. This is episode 11, The Curious Case of Mary Moore. This episode is dedicated to Jane Martin. In this episode, we're joined once again by Katie Liddane. But before we get started and we talk about the curious case of Mary Moore, I just wanted to help people understand, if they're not familiar with the Northeast and Newcastle, who exactly is Mary Moore, where did she come from, and why are we talking about her in relation to the Newcastle Witches. So one of the witches who was killed in Newcastle in 1650 was actually from Northumberland. And Northumberland is a county north of Newcastle, and it stretches all the way up to the Scottish border. Mm-hmm. In this episode, you're going to hear about a place called Berwick. And Berwick, I think it is still the most northern town in England.
Yeah, in the borders, yeah.
Yeah, very close to the Scottish border. A very important border town. You're also going to hear about Alnwick, which is another town quite close to the coast in Northumberland, and Holy Island, which is a tidal island just off the coast of the northeast of England. And it also goes by the name of Lindisfarne. So that's just to set the scene for people that we're not necessarily in Newcastle, but this story is still relevant to the Newcastle Witches, and we're going to find out why exactly. And this is what we're here to do today. At the centre of our episode is a pamphlet called Wonderful News from the North, and its author is a woman called Mary Moore. She is a well-off, well-connected woman living in Northumberland, and she is able to write and publish a pamphlet detailing a story where her children are affected by witchcraft conducted by other women from Northumberland, one of them being Jane Martin. So as well as geography to keep track of, there are lots of people mentioned in the pamphlet, and we'll try and keep it as succinct as possible in our retelling. But just to give people an idea of who the main characters are in this story, there's Mary Moore, and she has 3 children, a daughter called Margaret, George, who we think is older than Margaret, and Betty, who is the younger sibling. She marries a man called Edward Moore, who already has 7 children, 6 sons and a daughter. And so it's a very big, a blended family, as it were. And after getting married, Mary and Edward Moore have another child called Sibylla. In her pamphlet, Mary Moore is going to accuse primarily first a woman called Dorothy Swinnow, who is very wealthy, well married. Mary Moore and Dorothy Swinnow are already in some kind of disagreement around an inheritance, which we can talk about as well. But she'll also come to accuse Dorothy Swinnow and Jane Martin and Jane's sister, Margaret White, of witchcraft and making her children sick. So this is in no means an easy story to describe within the limits of our podcast episode. But hopefully we can unpick a few really crucial details, because at the end of this story, Jane Martin will be found guilty and will be hung alongside the Newcastle Witches for witchcraft. And this testimony goes into a real lot of detail into what kind of witchcraft she was believed to be guilty of. Thank you for coming back to the Candle and Bell studio, Katie, and helping us understand this very special pamphlet.
Yeah, so the pamphlet in itself is really interesting in the history of English witchcraft as a whole. Again, it has a very long title. It's a 17th century text, around a paragraph's worth. And it begins, wonderful news from the north, or a true relation of the sad and grievous torments inflicted upon the bodies of 3 children of Mr. George Mewshamp, late of the county of Northumberland, by witchcraft. Why the pamphlet is so rare and so interesting is because it has a female author, and this is a rare phenomenon in the world of English witchcraft pamphlets. It was written by Mary More, who is the mother of the 3 children mentioned in the title. And looking at how we connect the Newcastle Witch Trials to English witchcraft as a whole, and kind of how as a country people communicated their stories and their fears about witchcraft, is really important here, because although we know that there was a publisher in Newcastle at the time that the pamphlet was released in 1650, it seems that Mary More chose to have her story published in London. So she made the decision to bypass the kind of more provincial Newcastle publisher to have her story published in the capital. There's the kind of indication that she was already dissatisfied with local authorities. She felt that they weren't helping in the way that they should, which is partly why she had the pamphlet published in the first place. But there is the sense of kind of calling for the attention of higher authorities to be listened to, and as a wealthy woman she could kind of use her privilege to spread the news further than some of the other cases in the area.
She's quite the socialite. She travels around, and I think that's one of the things that also, and apart from the fact that she was able to publish this, we could probably ascertain that, or assume that she was a well-connected person, because she mentions a lot of people in, like, Colonel this and that, and so and so from Holy Island, and this person and that person. So she seems to be using a lot of influence in society in the Northeast to kind of make her case against the person that she accuses of witchcraft.
Yeah, so you can kind of see that she's very self-aware in the importance of bringing all of the evidence that she can, and that means from very influential figures. So she talks about consulting doctors from Newcastle, Durham and Edinburgh, which gives us the Scottish connection again. And like you say, a lot of the witnesses that she mentions are captains and colonels, or they're from very wealthy established families in the region, like the Selbys and the Fenwicks and things like that. So
yeah,
she definitely knew what she was doing and had the power to do it.
So where does this story begin?
So the events of the pamphlet actually begin in 1645, so 5 years before the pamphlet sees the light of day, and 5 years before Jane Martin was executed for the crimes that she's accused for within the pamphlet. And Margaret Mewshamp, who was Mary More's child from a previous marriage to George, began experiencing what she'd later call symptoms of possession, but it started out as a heavenly or angelic experience, according to her and her mother's understanding. And this links again to the spiritual vulnerability of children. So children at the time were regarded as kind of more easily influenced by both good and evil. When at first she was kind of being visited by angels and having visions of angels, it later became more demonic in nature, in that she became unable to speak, eat, walk, and was retching to vomit. Part of her symptoms were also that she'd fasted for 16 weeks but looked completely fine, and she hadn't lost any kind of shape or colour to her cheeks at all. And then while her mother was absent in Newcastle at the time, Margaret motioned to be carried outside by her cousin, and then ran out into the woods screaming. And at this point, George, her brother, also became sick.
So I guess like the spell or this sickness that Margaret had was now spreading to the other children.
Yeah, this is where we see it kind of spread beyond Margaret into the wider family. Later, her sister Betty also becomes ill, but when we start to look at the family dynamics happening here with a blended family, Mary and her children were taken in by Edward More, who had 7 children of his own. Yeah, it becomes very interesting when you realise that it's only Mary's children from the previous marriage plus her new child with Edward Moore that become sick. So we can start to look at this as kind of maybe an expression of Mary's anxiety about her children within this new marriage.
At the beginning of the pamphlet, though, these visions, the sickness, whatever, it's almost seen as like a blessing, I think, or a good thing.
Yeah, so almost a privilege for Margaret to experience.
She says, like, "Do not weep for me, for I have seen a happy sight and heard a blessed sound."
Yeah, so it was almost a kind of display of Margaret's virtue and purity. Before things even become demonic, Mary Moore mentions the people that she's inviting in to witness what is happening and the doctors that are keen to observe Margaret's condition. So, yeah, I wouldn't. It's still like a spectacular occurrence, as other witchcraft cases are recorded as, but not necessarily a criminal matter to begin with.
I mean, that's another really fascinating thing, that she did get from her account so many people to come and look at her daughter just to witness it. And she says, like, Sir William Selby, his lady, the Countess Lendrick, the Lady Haggerston, and many others. And just like the pamphlet is full of these names of people, I don't know, but maybe, people of some kind of influence or standing, otherwise she wouldn't have mentioned them. She was really eager for people to witness what was going on with her daughter.
Yeah, definitely. And if we believe her narrative of events beginning as far back as 1645, she's had 5 years to put this together. And it wasn't necessarily a diary, so she wasn't kind of just recording things as they were happening. She's gone back after it does become demonic in nature, and you get shipwrecks and one of the witches appearing in the form of a dragon, a bear, a horse, and a cow. That's definitely going to affect how she then goes back and writes the beginning of the narrative and the witnesses that she wants to add into this.
So when do things start to turn demonic?
Yeah, so she asks for some fresh air, and when she's kind of set down in the back garden, I suppose, she just runs out into the woods screaming, and that's when George, her brother, gets sick, and she's kind of returned to bed, and things go quite far downhill from there, I suppose.
Yeah, it's about to get very interesting, and also quite weird and spooky. I feel like you should have the honour of walking us through the testimony and what Margaret is about to describe to her mother.
Margaret starts to describe what I mentioned just there, essentially, how a man that she refers to as the rogue starts to visit her, and it's not quite clear if it's kind of physically or in her dreams, in this trance state that she's experiencing, and fights with her, as I said, in the form of a dragon, a bear, a horse, and a cow. So we've got shape-shifting starting to enter the content of the pamphlet. And shape-shifting into a dragon especially is quite rare.
I find it just fascinating testimony, and really unusual to hear this coming from such a young person, an 11-year-old girl living in Northumberland.
It is definitely unusual in accounts that we see, especially in other children's accounts of witchcraft too.
Could you tell us about the codes Margaret used?
It is by this point that Margaret could not speak, so she couldn't name this man that she previously referred to as the rogue. But she did write down the names of people that she was starting to suspect of causing this possession. And she wrote the letters anyway, J-O-H-U, and then separately D-O-S-W-O. And the pamphlet kind of moves on from this to refer to a John Hutton. So that's our first candidate that lines up with these names. And he was actually a local cunning man. And just to explain cunning men a little bit more and how they differ from witches, they were kind of recognised as having uncommon gifts, I suppose, but it was more about skill rather than supernatural power. So knowledge of herbal remedies and things like that, and skill in divination, certain ways to tell the future that before the Witchcraft Act of 1604 kind of towed the line of witchcraft, or were considered a lesser crime within the hierarchy of witchcraft. And originally, Mary More sought his help to kind of end what was going on with Margaret. And coincidentally, with the names again, he says that he knows for a fact that it was Dorothy Swinnow that was causing the sickness.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So, messages from Margaret, a cunning man, already this history with Dorothy Swinnow. Is it ever explicitly said Dorothy Swinnow, or is it all coded and assumptions?
Kind of close enough. We get SWO, whereas her name is Swinnow, so it might have been like SWI instead, but that's enough for Mary More to kind of set her targets to Dorothy. So in their first meeting, that's when he implicates Dorothy, but then she begins to suspect, probably through Margaret's coded messages, that John Hutton is involved and the cause of her possession symptoms, I suppose. And she asks to take some of his blood, and this ties into what's quite a common practice in northeastern witchcraft, the act of scratching.
The act of what?
What
is the act of scratching?
So it's kind of either when people were not willing to wait to take cases to court, or things were more urgent. It was the logic that if you could get the blood from a witch by scratching her or him, usually in an area described as above the breath in local cases. So depending how literally you take that, we're looking kind of like from the nose up to the forehead. And the logic was, if you scratched the witch there and got her blood, it would break the spell.
Okay.
So it's kind of an out-of-court settlement for witchcraft, I suppose.
That's a really polite way of putting it, though, because, scratching, like you're physically hurting somebody.
Yeah, and I think the placement is quite interesting too. So rather than the secret places in a lot of pricking cases, this is a very visible area to kind of go out in public and have on display that you have at least been accused of witchcraft, to the point that people are willing to scratch and perhaps scar your face because of it.
And I suppose, unfortunately for John, Mary believes that this technique works.
Briefly after John had his blood taken, Margaret was okay for a while.
Was he willing? Did he agree to get scratched? Was there a bit of debate about it? Or
he actually, in the pamphlet, he's definitely under duress, but he I think he says that he recognises that his life is in Mary's hands. So he knows that he's kind of making this bargain almost, and kind of being willingly scratched in order to hopefully stave off any further progress with prosecuting him for witchcraft, because he knows that could end up in a much worse result.
And of course Margaret gets better.
Yeah, so Margaret gets better, and on Mary's journey back from taking the blood, there's a huge storm as well, and that actually causes one of the ships to crash into Berwick Harbour, and that's where one of the witnesses is on one of the ships, and it kind of brings in more influential names. And
okay, so now we're talking beyond visions and inability to speak. There's some sort of conspiracy of witches. I mean, if I was John Hutton, I'd be a little frightened.
As Margaret's illness does progress, John Hutton, trying to literally save his own neck, implicates the Miller and Webster's wives. That's how he refers to them at first. But we know that this was Jane and Margaret White.
Webster being another term for a weaver. So these women were not affluent and well-connected people. They were a different social class to Mary More.
So yeah, at this point, when Margaret's illness continues and John Hutton implicates Jane Martin and Margaret White, John is then jailed, but in Newcastle, actually. He's taken to, in the pamphlet it says Newcastle Jail, and this was likely in Newcastle Castle. So in the cellar area of the keep, and that was currently being used as a jail by the mid-17th century. He's later mentioned as dying in jail, and for Mary More to kind of add extra evidence of this supernatural connection between John and Margaret, Margaret is aware of this news before anyone else. But yeah, when John was jailed, a warrant was not granted for Dorothy Swinnow, who is the main target of.
And he's already accusing Dorothy and Jane Martin and Margaret White, but they aren't arrested at this point.
Not at this point, no. When the warrant is not granted for Dorothy Swinnow, that's when Mary More turns her attention to Jane Martin and Margaret White.
Interesting, okay.
And we think why the warrant wasn't granted for Dorothy is because she was wealthy and at the time the wife of Colonel Swinnow, and she was able to flee to Berwick, where the local justice kind of essentially harboured her there and refused to release her back to Mary More's custody, I suppose.
Wow. But the Millers and the Webster's wives were obviously not that well connected or affluent, and they were sort of right in the firing line then.
Essentially, yeah. But it's actually Margaret White that makes the confession. That's something that we don't really see of anyone else involved in this case.
So the confession is taken down by Master Edward Ord, and it's Margaret White of Chatton on her own confession of herself. And this, I think, is taken in Berwick, this testimony. So just to give our listeners an idea of what is in this confession, because it's fascinating and it's one of the only confessions we have. It says that the devil came to her in the likeness of a man in blue clothes in her own house. He gave her a nip on the shoulder and another on her neck. And she confesses that her familiar came to her in the likeness of a black greyhound, and that the devil had carnal knowledge of her in her own house 2 several times. And Mistress Swinnow and the said Margaret, her sister, came purposely to the house of Master Edward More of Spittal to take away the life of Margaret Machamp and Mary, and they were the cause of the children's tormenting. And she confesses that they tried 3 several times to have taken away their lives, and especially on St. John's Day at night, gone 12 months. And she says that God was above the devil. It goes on into more detail, and it's really, it does sound demonic, and you wonder like why she has said these things, and if she was coerced into saying them, or I guess you can only wonder, I suppose. I mean, and I really like this. This is like a really weird sentence. Mistress Swinnow came riding in a riding coat on a little black nag to the Spittal, and she and her sister were also the occasion and had a hand in the death of the said child. I guess they're talking about the child that Mary More gave birth to.
Yeah. I think they're talking about Sibylla More, and I think it says earlier in the pamphlet that she believed that the witches had tried to cause a miscarriage, but it hadn't worked, and God had protected Sibylla from that. But then she later died not long after birth. So you see these quite like horrific experiences that the family are going through, with child mortality being like quite high at the time, and the sickness of several of the children. But you see this alongside some quite strange and inane in a way details, like the devil appearing in blue clothing, and Margaret White also says that the devil had a special nickname for Jane Martin. He called her Bess. Or Bessie. So you're quite surprised at those details being included, and the fact that Jane was also reportedly responsible of causing Richard Stanley to have a sore leg.
It is really fascinating. When you take out the witch element, like you said, like looking at this family, they must have been going through some horrendous stuff. Then you put in like the testimony and you have all this added drama, I guess, to almost make it more believable, maybe, just like to kind of prove like, oh yeah, I'm friends with the devil, he has a nickname for me, and to further implicate her sister.
Definitely, yeah. And again, it kind of shows Mary's construction of the pamphlet in a way. She's kind of determined to include all of the evidence and detail that she can in order to kind of present this as something that she'd really gone through. And with these kind of smaller details coming from Margaret, from Margaret implicating her sister Jane in this, you get a different sense of she's willing to tell her investigators everything that they want to hear, and in a way that she's almost like grasping at straws and just telling them things in a way to like hopefully satisfy them, so the questioning will end.
Dorothy's gotten away, is it? But still, Mary Moore makes the point of in this confession by Margaret White of mentioning Dorothy. Do you think like she's pissed off basically that one of the guilty parties has gotten away? And is that maybe like at the beginning you said like she was probably frustrated with the authorities, in the northeast, that's why she went to London. Could you maybe like have a real bee in her bonnet about Dorothy and that witch got away?
Yeah, definitely. You can see that the pamphlet actually concludes with a plea to indict Dorothy in the same way that has been done with Margaret and Jane. So that's a kind of another function of the pamphlet, as well as to like publicise this story and this what she sees as like an ongoing case of witchcraft to warn others. It's actually a call to arms to continue to pursue Dorothy.
So she finally has this confession. In the meantime, what's happening with the children?
So there's been the death of Sibylla, but Margaret, George and Betty are still experiencing sickness as the pamphlet concludes.
So they never get better?
Not within the narrative of the pamphlet permanently,
Okay.
I wouldn't say.
Okay, so we're starting to see like a bit more about Mary Moore and understanding like what she might have been going through. She's obviously hell-bent on the witches angle at this time. Is there any reason, like at this time, are there any other witch trials happening, or is she influenced from sort of witch trials in the wider country or in Scotland?
So I'd say there's definitely potential that she had heard the news of the Witchfinder arriving into Newcastle. Because this kind of occurs alongside his invitation, like the petition to invite him, right through to the execution of the Newcastle Witches. But as we mentioned earlier, she's also quite well connected into Scotland herself as well. So there's the Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1649 to 50 happening like in tandem with this.
So she has witches sort of on the brain, isn't it? It's a bit of like almost self-fulfilling prophet, like I don't know what's the term, or confirmation bias, I don't know, cut this out, but what is it, like when you start thinking like it must be the cause, you get sort of quite a narrow focus when everybody around you is talking about witches and supernatural intervention. You're looking at your children who are very sick, you almost had a miscarriage, your infant dies, you start to become convinced.
Yeah,
this
definitely
could be something.
Especially because the pamphlet does kind of pick up in the middle of Mary's kind of vendetta against Dorothy.
Yeah.
So Margaret's sickness isn't even where this feud to a certain extent begins, So you can almost see Margaret's sickness as her tipping point in a way.
Yeah. Okay, so what was the feud? What were the accusations against Dorothy apart from being a witch?
So Dorothy had also been accused of killing Mary's sister, Lady Hambleton, with the awareness that Lady Hambleton was only able to keep her family estate for a lifetime, and when she died it would go to another branch of the family through marriage instead.
Okay.
So as well as this sickness and tensions in the blended family, you've also got an inheritance scandal, I suppose, going on.
Oh, so the plot thickens. But we know, we've heard this before, that inheritance could be a driving factor in accusing somebody of witchcraft.
Yeah, the section mentions that Dorothy had apparently killed Lady Hambleton through witchcraft, knowing that the family would then not inherit the estate.
And who would get the estate?
It would go to the husband of Lady Hambleton's daughter instead. So it essentially crosses over to another local wealthy family.
But what would Dorothy stand to gain from that?
She doesn't quite get into the detail of it because it's kind of used in the pamphlet to furnish the story of demonic possession and kind of to give Dorothy this background reputation
to make her look suspect, I suppose, to make her look like an untrustworthy person.
We don't really know. We're not given a copy of Lady Hambleton's will, unfortunately. That would have been great for this, but we don't know if Dorothy would have directly inherited or she's concerned that members of her family won't.
Okay.
So you do see this kind of, again, perhaps like an anxiety about family connections and the inheritance of wealth, and this kind of manifesting itself in the form of witchcraft. She's kind of using the language that's so common both sides of the border at this time to articulate her own personal fears, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay. God, it's a complicated story to unpick, and unfortunately it results in Margaret and Jane being convicted of witchcraft and locked away in jail. Is this correct?
Yes, so unfortunately for us, Jane Martin is the only one recorded as having been executed. We don't really get to find out what happened to Margaret, and we know that John died in jail. But Jane Martin was hanged alongside the Newcastle Witches and the 9 Moss Troopers, also from the border regions.
And Jane Martin would have been taken down from a jail, likely in Morpeth or Berwick, and then kept overnight in the Newcastle Castle before being executed. And if Margaret wasn't executed, we can, I think, assume that she probably died in jail.
Mm-hmm. And there's another quite interesting link between this case and the Newcastle Witches. And this case is the Henry Ogle, who famously pursued the fraudulent witchfinder into Scotland.
He was the High Sheriff of Northumberland, according to this pamphlet.
Yes, and he actually heard Margaret's confession and was involved in the prosecution of this case.
He chased or pursued the witchfinder from the Newcastle Witch Trials, didn't he? He went in pursuit of him to show him up as a fraud. It reminds me of what David Silk was talking about in terms of how there was an actual trial and people had more faith in that legal system than maybe witch pricking and things like that. But this was a very rational argument, and when you have somebody produce a confession, then that maybe felt more justified that yes, this person is a witch, her sister is a witch, John Hutton was involved in this circle of witches. This is all perfectly normal and we can prove it in a court of law. This pamphlet, which is sort of the testimony of Mary Moore, ends essentially, I guess, with almost like a warrant or a call to arrest Dorothy Swinow on charges of witchcraft and infanticide for killing the Sibylla. We don't really know what happens, but I get the feeling that it isn't just, even though we might not have any evidence of what happens later, Mary Moore does not give up on this.
This is the point where she disappears from records, in this sense. I definitely think that this would have followed both her and Dorothy for years to come.
But we don't have any record of what might have... Because you can't imagine, it's like if you're charging somebody with witchcraft and infanticide, then...
Yeah, you don't really publish the pamphlet and give up there.
Yeah.
So she may well have kind of railed against the local justice system to do something about Dorothy. But as far as we know, she didn't take any more action. So you don't really see any kind of phenomenon that pops up later, such as the reverse witch trial, in which people who had accusations of witchcraft made against them would take their accusers to court for defamation and things like that. Dorothy either fled further or stayed where she was kind of protected in Berwick, and Mary Moore continued her life with her 10 children, I suppose.
Do we know how people reacted to this pamphlet? Because it's quite, it's incredible. The testimony, the eyewitness accounts, the witnesses. It's quite a shocking pamphlet to read even nowadays.
We know it was published in London, and it was published, we suspect, by Thomas Harper, who had also published previously on witchcraft as well, including the Richard Brome play, The Lake Lancashire Witches, as well. So Mary may have been aware, but Thomas Harper was definitely aware of the appetite for this kind of news. But as it was happening in 1650, sort of past the tipping point of witch hunting in England, it didn't secure the same audience that it might have if it had been published a little earlier.
I think now we get a real sense of possibly the kind of crimes that all of them were accused of. It's like, children were really sick, a child died. That's not an easy thing, whichever century we're in.
Yeah.
It's a horrifying thing to witness. And that's probably maybe true for a few of other witches in the Newcastle Witch Trials, that they were sort of guilty, in inverted commas, of doing real harm to people.
Yeah, definitely. With the context that Joe mentioned of the plague being in living memory, the sieges and things like that, and the harvest crisis of the end of the 1640s too, it definitely adds to this idea of witchcraft as an explanation for the horrors that people in this area were experiencing at the time.
Katie, thank you so much for joining us yet again on the podcast and for walking us through this testimony and this pamphlet. You've been listening to the Newcastle Witches Podcast. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back again next time with an episode about Anne Armstrong.